Hallelujah, Christ is risen. It is Easter Sunday, and you'd never know it if you looked at the gospel we read this morning. 8 short verses, and the women leave in fear and trembling. That's what we have to work with this morning. I have a real affinity for these women. Right back from the beginning of, the middle of verse 15, when they are first introduced as having been there the whole time. They're on the hill watching as Jesus is crucified. Now, part of the role of women in that society, there was actually guilds for this, was that they came together to properly dispose of a body after they've been executed. Because even in death, no matter how they had been in life, they deserved dignity in being laid to rest. So the women who were following Jesus, it was their job to watch while he was properly put into the tomb, and then to embalm him and to make sure his body was taken care of for the natural processes of decomposition that would happen after the stone was rolled back into place. So they were in the zone. They had spent the day before thinking and planning and mourning, and they came that morning with everything they needed on the way to the tomb. And then one of them said, "Oh, the rock, how we roll a stone away." And that probably took over their attention. As they moved forward, they saw that the rock was gone. And they had to think about new reasons, like why was it? Has the tomb been vandalized? Is Jesus' body even still there? All of these things were going on that morning. And they get to the tomb, and the angel is there and says, "If you're looking for Jesus, he's not here. He's risen. He's gone to Nazareth. He's waiting for you. Go get the others and go back to Nazareth." Absolutely full stop. Everything they had planned and expected. And they're given a new bit of information, and they have to deal with it. And their first thing they do is exhibit shock. And they run. And it's pretty human reaction from them. These women were all older women. Even Mary Magdalene, we tend to paint her as an ingenue, which I think is a great disservice to her character, as much of a disservice as painting her as a prostitute always has been. This is a woman who is only ever, in the entire 4 Gospels, identified with her city, with her town. Every other Mary, every other woman in the Gospel is identified by a relationship with a child, usually a son, and with the sibling. But Mary alone is a person identified with her town, which means she didn't have any living children or anybody of note who she was related to. The fact that she paid out of her own pocket to help Jesus' ministry probably meant that she was an older businesswoman, quite used to making her own choices. No one thought anything of it. Identifying her as Mary Magdalene made complete sense to the 4 Gospel writers. And they continued that tradition down through history. Mary is only ever a person from a town. But she's the consistent one there. Every gospel has her at the narrative. Even when everybody else changes, she is constantly there. So it's her story as much as it is Jesus. And she is with the women this morning as they are given the news by this, we assume, an angel. We're not told anything except that they look like a young man. And their absolute shock in how they respond. And they run away. And that's how we're left with the gospel. It is incredibly unsatisfying. There's no revealing of Jesus. There's no walking in the garden. There's no disciples running in to get their own sight to see if they can see anything. It is just complete stop of story, not even end. And if this was a drama production, you can imagine someone in the audience would stand up and say, "What? That's it? That's where you're stopping this?" The frustration is so great that people in the early church added 2 more endings to it just so they could have their own completion. Neither one of them was written by the original author. We also, in our modern age, we're not satisfied with this. We want the nice, neat bow. Just about every commentary I consulted before I put my sermon together this morning all of it had to control an aspect of it. They couldn't just let the story be. They couldn't let those women be in shock and then quickly get out of shock to spread the word. And they must have spread the word because they're the only ones who were given the message of resurrection, and yet we know about it. So they obviously did not stay silent for the rest of their lives. But their immediate thought was terror, excitement, and terror. We don't feel that anymore in Easter, and maybe we should. Maybe it's time for us to feel both excitement and terror. We, like the early writers in the early church, like so many of the commentaries I wrote, like so many preachers around the world today and through history, want to tie up Easter in a nice little bow. Even society tells us this is the only day we're going to celebrate. No recognition that this is the first day of the next 7 weeks. We've entered a new season in the church year, and every week we're going to be looking at Jesus appearing to some of his followers. We don't want to recognize that this story is open ended. It doesn't have a nice, satisfying conclusion. And I think Mark wanted us to feel that. We need to be with those women on Easter morning. We need to feel absolute shock. Not kind of resignation that, well, of course, we knew this was going to come because, we celebrate this every year. We know how the story ends. We need to buff out of that. We need to start to feel what that first century person, what the first century community would have felt. Jesus had promised them this was going to happen. 3 times he laid it out. This was going to be. He was going to be charged, and he was going to be executed, and he was going to rise from the dead. And the disciples did not want to hear it. And presumably these women were with the entire group. And we don't know if they wanted to hear it or not, but they probably didn't understand it. And they didn't understand to expect it. What they understood was the hard, cold reality of the job they had to do as the elder women in their traveling community. It was their job. Otherwise, strangers would have been handling Jesus' body, and that was not how it was done. They had to get in there and make sure he was put to rest properly. Tunnel vision. They were not thinking about any other possibilities. To let that level of hope in would have been too painful. They had watched him die. The concept of him returning to life was just beyond anything they could imagine. And for us, it actually is mostly beyond anything we can imagine, too. We say the words, but what does it really mean that Jesus is alive again? That he came back, that death had no control over him? We've polluted the Easter story with all sorts of symbolism and myth, from Easter bunnies to eggs to the need for chocolate to all sorts of stuff. We pollute the story. We don't even want to stay in the moment. It's hard to stay in the moment. This whole concept of absolute mind-blowing ecstasy, that the one who taught you there is a new way to live life has now come back himself as this incarnation of a new existence. Walking, talking, teaching, being among you defies logic, defies everything you want to know. And even those who are quite comfortable saying, well, it's very mystical, very spiritual, at the core, there's still that desire for the tangible and explainable. There is nothing explainable about Easter morning. This is a moment of pure faith that you have to believe. We have to be those women. Because if you really think about it, they had no evidence. They had this young person telling them Jesus was alive and waiting for you in Galilee. That's all they had to work with. We don't know how long after they started talking. We're not given that information. We don't know how long after they actually went to Galilee. Maybe they were talked out of it. Maybe it took weeks. We don't know. But they had someone else tell them about this miraculous thing that they had to make peace with before they could believe it. We also have to make peace with this revelation so that we can continue on sharing it and really internalizing it. It is hard to accept someone coming back from the dead. It's the promise we all have. It's the thought we have sometimes when we walk through graveyards. It's the hope that comes when we're mourning those we love that we've lost way sooner than we were prepared to. This concept of resurrection, that we're all part of that promise, is hard. And it's even harder by the fact that it just doesn't seem to be coming anytime soon. The early church thought that the second coming of Jesus, the resurrection of all people, was imminent. Didn't come at the first century, didn't come at the second century, didn't come at the first millennia, didn't come at the second millennia. We've kind of lost the energy around Easter and what that promise means. We also are just running scared or exhausted or whatever emotion you want to put into it. And we're not really listening to the package, to the small message that Jesus is waiting for you. You have to go where he is, but he's waiting there. In body, this is not a spiritual journey. In body, you go to where Jesus is. Now, we as 20th century Christians don't have, or 21st century rather, don't have the opportunity of physically touching Jesus and convincing ourselves. We have to have the promise of our heart and the words of someone else. It's very difficult to believe someone else, especially in this day and age where we want to be able to touch things to see that they are real. The gospel isn't going to give us that opportunity. The gospel is going to require that we come in faith. As hard as that is, as demanding as that is, as illogical as that is, we on this Easter Sunday have to be people of faith that can believe the incredible, that are not going to always have the answers tied up into neat bows. And no matter how much we try to control and contain the message, it's not going to matter because it's not a controllable message. It's going to burst out at all sides and surprise us when we're least wanting it. Our job is to complete the story of those women. Our job is also to meet Jesus and to share this message, to tell people he's waiting for us. He's waiting for everybody. The promise is there. It's not restrictive. We in the Christian church do not control the promises of Christ. We might put language around it. We might like to own it, but we, in the end of the day, are not the guardians of this message. It is for the entirety of humanity, whether they want to hear it or not. Christ was resurrected to bring in a new way of living. His life on earth taught us how that was supposed to look, but it was the promise of resurrection, the return to life of something that had been dead, that inspires us, that leads us, that draws us to something more. This being that is always with us, who promises us a future we cannot imagine. We run from the tomb, but eventually the shock will wear off. And we are now asked to continue the journey of those women, to go and tell. That's our job. Not to just sit comfortably and while someone else does all the speaking, but to actually take the responsibility individually to go and tell. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have fancy language. Just go and tell of resurrection. The promise of renewed life is ours for the sharing. Happy Easter.